It's day one of a brand new metagame. Let's take a look at what decks are succeeding in High Infinite in Marvel Snap. This is the deck I've been playing the most recently, and expect a full breakdown tomorrow, so remember to like and subscribe if that's something you want to see. This is a Mother Askani based deck, and in the wake of the void left by Star-Lord and Sholau in the shape of the metagame, Mother Askani has risen up to become a major part of it. But I think a lot of people are expecting it to be Mother Askani Gambit that is the dominant method of playing Mother Askani, and I've actually found that she's a little bit better off if you're doing a little bit more with both sides of the pie. Mother Askani is a card that copies a card, discounts a card, and buffs a card. Gambit does a lot with the copy, and it does a decent amount with the discount. But what you can do with the buff and the discount and the copy is manage to copy things that multiplicatively stack with each other. And that's really what this deck is about. Whether you're double copying Wolverine Horseman of War, or doing things like double copying a Captain Carter that then gets prodigied, buffs a Maverick, the Maverick goes to like 18 power, you have two Captain Carters in a lane, the 18 power goes on to a Brood, that Brood is then 60 power. That kind of stuff has felt very powerful for me. In terms of a deck that sort of sets the tone and hits the metagame hard in the mouth while people are still messing around, this is the one that feels like a potential frontrunner. I particularly enjoyed playing it to the degree that, as mentioned, I am going to be doing a full video breakdown on it tomorrow with a card-by-card guide to how to play the deck and what changes you can make. For now, I'll say this. I don't think you need to have Wolverine in order to play this deck. I think either Iska or Juggernaut would be a perfectly viable replacement. Now, Mother Askani is definitely showing up in Gambit Horseman of Death shells, and I think many people are afraid, myself a little bit among them, that Gambit Horseman of Death is going to be the next Horseman of the Apocalypse for the metagame. We saw two of the Horsemen, Sholau and Star-Lord, fall, and Gambit remains as this sort of next generation of unnerfed powerhouses in the metagame, alongside Doom 2099. But the interesting thing about Gambit is that while he is powerful, he is also quite limited. So what this deck is really getting out of Mother Askani is additional flexibility and additional ways to double down on creating a lot of points. Mother Askani on a Lin Lie is particularly compelling because you will be able to play enough cards that you should be able to get two swords and a Lin Lie, two Lin Lies and a sword, and oh, by the way, the Lin Lie's also got a bit of extra power. This is a notably powerful thing to do. The other thing that this deck does very well is notice that copying Mother Askani is actually also really, really good. It is not uncommon necessarily for you to be able to play a Mother Askani and then you might end up, say, miserying the Mother Askani, because that might actually just be a stronger thing to do. This has cut down on the need for Moon Girl and has allowed us to play Bastion as a method of more controlled putting things into our hand. This list comes from ELA, and it's more proof of concept than anything else. But I've seen plenty of metagames where V-Hand was what many people considered to be the strongest unnerfed deck and would obviously be the thing that was next up, and then she just sort of wasn't always able to capitalize on that initial hype. I think there is a lot of initial hype here, and a lot of it is deserved, but this is also the kind of deck that you can definitely build your deck to beat by just simply playing enough things that are expensive enough that the Gambit spam doesn't really meaningfully impact you. The real threat here is just Mother Askani allowing you to go over the top with copies of copies of copies. One early card I've seen rising up in a world that wants to try to beat up on the Gambit menace is Lady Deathstrike. This list comes from Ika, and it looks like a fairly anodyne mid-rangey list, but the Lady Deathstrike does so much incredible work here against both of the two decks that we talked about. The secret to beating up on Captain Carter decks is blowing up the Captain Carter if you can. And now granted, you might not always be able to do so. Maybe it's at 4 power, maybe it got buffs. They're going to have to figure out specific ways to play around that, but even then you have Magneto, which is particularly good against decks full of 3s. And the other thing you can do to beat the Gambit decks is just blow up their Gambits. They're going to be trying to copy those. You can just make them not happen some of the time, because other than Mother Askani, their copies are kind of happening on the field. And that means that you just have a lot of control against two of the popular up-and-coming Mother Askani decks, which are going to be popular not just because they're strong, but because there's a new card in them that people are finally getting to try out. And this kind of deck, while maybe it doesn't necessarily have the bones to carry itself into a larger role in the metagame later on, this is still a Scream deck that is going to be a little bit fundamentally capped by its own output, does have access to two potentially very powerful tools that are dealing with a lot of what people are playing and experimenting with in this early metagame, punishing people for doing so. There is a thought I've had that it's possible we're vastly overthinking this, and that Doom 2099 with a Mobius in it just kind of covers a lot of the Askani stuff that I would otherwise be worried about. Being able to play something like Mobius Sandman into a deck that is so focused on final turn output with discounts, like, this feels like a deck that should put everything we've talked about in the dumpster. There are not very many good Lady Deathstrike targets. There is a ton of power in here. You have Mobius and Sandman to deal with the decks that are just like doing various Mother Askani things with really powerful final turns. You're probably just gonna beat up on basically everybody. This is a deck that I think might have to show up and sort of reset the tone. We're doing a lot of cool stuff in this metagame right now, but let's dial it back and remember that Cosmic Ghost Rider, Sandman, and Mobius are here to make sure that things don't get too ridiculous. By the same token, I am a fan of the baseline Aurora deck, but I find it a little bit difficult to justify right now. I've seen a ton of people playing it, and it is a really cool, really fun deck that got a lot of power thanks to the upgrade that putting Mysterio into this deck conveyed. I just feel like I've kind of beaten it every time I've played against it. And I think that there's a weird dynamic here where typically the thought process is, this is the one that has more tech, and Doom 2099 is the one that has more power. But when you actually look at what you're trying to beat in the metagame right now, Mobius and Sandman are kind of going a lot farther than the tech in here. Cosmic Ghost Rider is kind of going a lot farther. So if you compare these two decks as like Aurora decks, they're cousins, they're brothers, they're sisters, whatever, they're the Habsburgs. This is a deck that I think stacks up just a little bit shorter. It's a cadet branch, if you will. Back to various Mother Askani shenanigans. This deck, like the first deck on the list, was created by Smiz, and it is trying to do a very similar thing. The point here is just double up on Mother Askani, who is currently one of the stronger cards to come out, a new card that looks potentially very, very powerful when unchecked, and the duplication is particularly notable in decks that are heavy on synergy. There's a reason that what you're seeing it in is Surfer, is ongoing decks, and in V-Hand. These are all synergy-based combo decks. Mother Askani is sort of the, like, I won't go so far as saying she's the best Frigga to ever be played, but she's the Frigga that rewards you the most for playing her. Now, granted, she is also expensive, and there are downsides to that, but she tends to pay for herself in certain cases, although I have particularly enjoyed the card Hope Summers in the other list in order to make sure that I'm actually realizing the gains from Mother Askani. I think that that is a big part of building around this card. Like, the Iron Man in here feels so okay when you hit it with Mother Askani, and like, if it is on that side of your hand, you're never going to play it beforehand, so you are going to hit it with Mother Askani, and it's like, okay, I would have really rather hit something that costs 4 so I could do 3/3 on the final turn of the game, like that kind of stuff. I would have rather hit something that costs 2 so I can just get that out there basically for free. Mother Askani scales with cheap stuff, and there are some dueling incentives in here. The other thing you're going to want to consider is the Gambit Horseman matchup. I've seen, for example, Derek doing something in a similar space here, but is not running the Iron Man and has instead put in armor, and there's a Gorgon in there as well, just to sort of potentially deal with the specific Victoria hand matchup. From KM Worst, a classic Batroc control deck. The real question for this deck is whether or not it's going to be able to facilitate the right cards in its shell to be a control deck. It really only has a couple of flex spots here, and those flex spots are the two really expensive cards in the deck. Thing First Steps is a fine choice, but might not be the perfect one. Maybe it needs to be a Cosmic Ghost Rider. Stardust is okay, but might not be the exact right decision either, and this deck will live and die by the decisions it makes there. It's also a deck that has some Gambit issues, right? This is one of those decks that is not set up well to be an armor deck, because typically the way it wants to play is by doing this Sam Wilson Craven stuff in separate lanes, so one of them is always going to get got even if you have the armor, and when you're being forced to play in that way, it's a typically pretty unpleasant thing to see your opponent copying Gambits. I almost wonder if this is one of those decks that needs to adjust by, instead of running Thing First Steps, running Lady Deathstrike and maybe running a Mobius instead of the Stardust. But I do think that there is potential future for that as long as it is able to do so. The problem is the Lady Deathstrike is kind of liable to hit some of your stuff too. The power output here is still good. The question is just what tech shell we need in order to actually be able to compete with this stuff. Maybe it's a Supergiant angle. I'm not entirely sure, but there is definitely some room to improve here. There's been a lot of noise around Tribunal being dead with the Onslaught change, and while I think that's true of the Mr. Fantastic builds, it might not be true of a more traditional Living Tribunal list, which is not really built around doing too many Onslaught copies anyway. Yeah, okay, you lose out on some of the games where you, like, wave out an Onslaught on 4, and then mystique that Onslaught, and then play an Iron Man, and then put a Tribunal in that lane. I get it. But those are not really the most common things to happen in this deck. And most of the time, what you're looking at is like an Iron Man. Maybe there's a Mystique on the Iron Man, and then you put the Onslaught down, and then you put the Tribunal down. Things like that. Like, you're still going to have plenty of power in those situations. And it's not going to be all that different unless you are mystiquing specifically the Onslaught. That's really the point where you start losing out on power here. So I think that this deck will still be able to catch people off guard, and especially if they are doing things like Gambit, Horseman of Death. Like, okay, all the cards I care about are 6s, right? Like 5s and 6s, nothing else matters. You cannot beat this, right? Whenever you're playing one of those decks that just doesn't really have anything for this, there's less Cosmic Ghost Rider running around because there's less Jocasta Sholau running around, and there's less Star-Lord running around. So really, it's just Doom 2099, who not a lot of people are playing because, and I don't want to overstate this, I think they're wrong not to play it. But yeah, people just kind of aren't. And I think that this is one of those things where it's like, there is actually kind of an opening here, because I've seen approximately 0 Enchantresses and 0 Cosmic Ghost Riders and a lot of Gambits that do not a lot of things in this matchup. This is every Zenaid deck ever. It is a pure stats pile built around Techno-Organic Virus, Efficient Stats, Mother Askani, and Juggernaut. As many cards in here as say win the lane as you can possibly get to. Stack up numbers, play Juggernaut, have Iron Patriot cards, have a bunch of ridiculous cards, play a classic mid-range game, and if you're worried about Gambit, well, you can win at least one lane with the armor, and you can win the other lane with the Juggernaut. That is the basic premise here. It is a premise that is pretty Juggernaut dependent, right? Like, and there are some really cool things that this deck can do. There's a ton of awesome copying that is available to it. Lots of really cool things that can happen thanks to a Mother Askani, just a point package here. But it is the kind of deck that's going to have to adjust to the metagame. This is one of the purest, I guess you'd call it, aggro decks in Marvel Snap currently. And that sort of is Zenaid's wheelhouse. Just decks that are stats, 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 door slammer, stats, 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 door slammer. That's really what this deck builder is about, and it's a very streamlined iteration of this. You're going to have prio basically the whole game. You're going to have more points than your opponent basically the whole game, and then you really need your disruption to come through, or you really need to be smart about point allocation if they manage to pull a combo off. From Butt, a C7 deck. Now, he made me choose between C6 and C7, and I'm not going to make the obvious joke because it's 2026 and we don't do those anymore. But This is a deck that I think is very much the kind of thing that you can get away with early in a Marvel Snap metagame and then will probably not show up again. So if you are a fan of something that is offbeat and weird, being able to play Cosmic Ghost Rider Firelord with Luke Cage in your deck is a very fun point allocation system. Cerebro obviously is a relevant thing. I do think it's fairly likely that C6 is a little bit more common, but I do think it's interesting that C7 has the abilities that it does now because it gets to be a bit of a Star-Lord deck now that Star-Lord is no longer gaining power. Speaking of Star-Lord, how the mighty have fallen, I saw a lot of people talking about how he's still good in Grand Arena. Kiss of death. All right, so that is 10, count them, 10. I really hope it's actually 10 lists that you can play on day one of the brand new metagame. I hope you enjoyed this look. I've been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.